Anyway, for history today, um, which you need to know, there will be an assignment that's going to be going live at 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock today, so it's going to be 10 questions. It's a little bit longer than our normal one because we haven't had any assignments over the last few lessons. So this one's going to be a little bit more all-encompassing, and then there will be another one that's a little bit longer. I don't know if it'll be 10 questions or, like 8 on Wednesday over this unit as we wrap it up. As you probably know, at this point, there are only 4 history classes left in the year in terms of normal history stuff. Then we'll have our week after that. But we are, we're getting to the end. So what we're going to do is today we're going to go over lesson 2. This is lesson 2, the end of the Cold War. You have to leave a little bit early because you have a rehearsal at 11. Okay, this is going to be super short. I've kept this lesson very, very short because, I didn't keep it necessarily that short, but it is pretty short. I didn't include some of the details about Poland, but we kind of have to start, and the reason is we kind of have to really start to consolidate everything so we can cover what I want to. So today we're going to do lesson 2. On Thursday we're going to do lesson 3, which basically just covers historical events of the 90s, more or less, around the world. And then the last 2 classes will cover the last things. Well, we have finals history. I'm not going to do some sort of final test. No, I'll probably post the our last assignment. There's a good chance it's just going to be the a copy of the pre-test that we took at the very beginning of the year, where I had you guys do that. I might do that same thing. Might edit that a little bit. I can't speak for other classes, Caden Reese, though. You have to talk with your teachers and other classes on what that's going to look like. It's probably not going to be a huge test like it would have been, but there may be a different way that they're doing it. But again, talk with them. They're the better sources. So yeah, next week we're just going to cover any history topics that I want. I feel like we need to talk about. We haven't talked about. We'll talk about 9/11, stuff like that. Any big historical events leading up to today. We're going to talk about each one of the elections from 2000 to 2016. And some other events around the world. Honestly, what's crazy is we're living through one of the biggest historical events of the millennium right now. As you probably realize, it's I asked the question earlier in the year, what's the biggest historical event of your lifetime? It was a tough question to answer. Now it's not so tough to answer, I don't think. But hey, that's just the world we're living in right now. So we'll talk about historical events leading up to today from basically the year 2000. Talk a little bit, focus on some Texas important people in Texas government and who we need to know. And how the world is continuing to change going to the present, and then that will be it for the year. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to look. We're not going to follow along with Unit 17 necessarily in our book, but I might take some resources or some questions from there, because they do talk about some of the stuff that I would like to. But yeah, that's basically what we're going to be looking at for the rest of the year. What we have today is pretty short. So we're gonna make our way through, and we're gonna talk about that, and we're gonna call it there and give you guys a little bit of extra time to work on your assignment. Make sure you are going back and looking through your notes, or if you're not 100% caught up on everything, you can obviously access my past broadcasts either on Twitch or YouTube. YouTube stores the older ones, but I think the last 2 should still be live on Twitch right now. So you can access those if you need to check out my notes. Again, I'm not posting my I'm not going to post my presentation notes unless you're somebody who is allowed to use those on like tests and stuff. I'll do that today after I'm done going live. So anyway, let's jump into it. So last time we talked about the Cold War, and we didn't talk much about the Cold War. We talked about Bush, we talked about Clinton, about their presidencies. We focused some on Ronald Reagan, Reaganomics, and how that worked. And now we're going to look at some of the foreign relations that the United States had, specifically with the USSR, and how that ended. Now, we said the end of the Cold War at this point, where we stop having that direct rivalry with the USSR. We're going to take a look at why that was able to happen and some effects that we could still feel today because of it. But first, in 1979, we had a new reemergence of the Cold War. Now, think back to the early 70s, and we talked about specifically with President Richard Nixon and his policy of détente, where he would actually, make these specific targeted diplomatic missions in an attempt to achieve a little bit more of a peaceful state with some of our biggest enemies, including China and the USSR. And things had started to die down a little bit as the relations were starting to grow stronger and not quite as contentious. But that ended in 1979 as the USSR invaded Afghanistan. So the United States condemned these actions, but they didn't necessarily take direct military action in the country of Afghanistan. Instead, they decided to help provide some of the rebels there with weapons to fight back the USSR. It was a way for them to get involved without, directly risking American lives. Now, obviously, this has had not necessarily the best effects, as even to this day, as we fight in Afghanistan, sometimes what we're fighting against are U.S. bought weapons from decades and decades ago. So these kind of things, these kind of actions, while it's obvious why the United States is trying to, stop the USSR's expansion here, but sometimes these things have a way to come back and bite us again in the end. So USSR does a few. The U.S. does a few things after the Soviets invade Afghanistan. They withdraw from the SALT II treaty, which basically it was an attempt to, secure some amount of peace and some amount of de-escalation of nuclear warheads between the two countries. They basically agreed to stop producing nukes at quite the pace they were. And they also refused to participate in the 1980 Olympics in Moscow as a show of protest. And there were many other nations that actually went along with that. It wasn't just the United States. There were several allies of the United States who decided that, we're not going to participate in this because USSR is being, aggressive, and we don't need to give them the glory of hosting the Olympics. It's an interesting policy, like an interesting diplomatic move there, primarily because it does hurt, the individual athletes who have worked a long time for this. But to the United States, it was a little bit more important that they show this in this scenario. That, however, did not keep them from participating in the Winter Olympics of the same year. They used to be, I believe, they used to be in the actual same year, the Winter and Summer Olympics. So they actually participated in the 1980 Olympics in Lake Placid, New York. And as we've talked about before, at the very beginning of the year, that picture up there in the top right, that is what's known as the Miracle on Ice. Now, again, for context, the Cold War had just begun to ramp up again. Most Americans had been used to living with this constant fear and anger and hatred towards the USSR most of their lives, but it started to die down and then ramped up all once again. And in this Olympics, you had the Soviets who were coming over with their hockey team, which was thought to be by far the best in the world. They had, trashed early opponents, and the United States was fielding a team of primarily non-professionals, like college athletes who were going to go out there and try and compete against this extremely difficult, extremely feared USSR team. And they were widely regarded as the underdogs. Most people felt like they had little to no chance of winning against the USSR, and they end up meeting in the semifinals, not the actual gold medal game, but the round before. And they managed to pull off an absolute miracle of victory. There's been, movies about it. The Miracle, dubbed one of the greatest American sports moments of all time. And it was actually kind of just a victory for all of America. It showed, another way that the United States had been able to overcome this evil force of the USSR. Remember, at the time, they were a lot of presidents and diplomats had been calling them just the focus of modern evil in the world, as Reagan says right there in the notes that you've taken. They were hated by many, so this was a gigantic moral victory in 1980, and the U.S. goes on to win in the gold medal game as well against Sweden, I think it is. But they managed to win there, and it's a huge victory for Americans across the country as they are able to unite behind this team. Um, as you know, sports have a certain way of uniting countries and uniting a lot of people during difficult times. That's why there's been so much focus to try and bring back what kind of semblance of sports we can. It's why the NFL draft last weekend had a huge viewership because it's things that like that bring us together. And it's what you know what I'm missing, probably one of the things that I'm missing the most. I don't know if it's the most, but it's up there. It's just that feeling of watching sports and coming together as friends and as a city and as a nation to root for the same cause. And it's something it's something that I'm hoping to get back to as soon as we can. Of course, we got to be safe, and I don't want to I can't get into too much detail about it, but it's something that I desperately miss. But anyway, back to the Cold War. With the USSR continuing to take aggressive actions across the globe, Reagan felt like there is a. William said, "Get Smart" is a good TV show showing American public opinion about the USSR during the Cold War. I don't think I've seen that. It's a good shot though. If you guys are looking for something to watch, I've definitely heard good things about it, but I've not watched it. Um, Anyway, Reagan spends over $100 billion during his first 5 years in office simply on military defenses, kind of to counter the USSR and make sure the United States is prepared. He hoped his new strategic defense initiative, which was nicknamed Star Wars, because that was something that was brand new in popular culture and just an absolute phenomenon at the time. Um, Hopefully, they could develop technology to destroy Soviet missiles, but it never obviously came to the point where they needed to defend directly. The comedy, not a documentary, by the way. Yeah, so if you want to watch that, I bet it's quite good. I have not seen it yet. Maybe I should during this time. We'll see. Appreciate it though, William. I really do. All right. So they're spending billions of dollars on the military, and as we saw with the chart, that's one of the primary reasons why Reagan had trouble to reduce the deficit during his time as president, because he was spending a lot on military. Now he's cutting taxes and cutting government spending in other areas, but this was a huge one that was ramped up for sure with this potential threat of going to war with the USSR, and you didn't want to be the one who was unprepared. There's that thought that, well, the USSR would invade us if we are not prepared. Like, hopefully we don't have to use any of this, but we still have to make sure we are representing as the most powerful militaristic country in the world, or else we risk all sorts of different, possible attacks. But of course, as we know, and the topic of this section was the Soviet Empire, the USSR, the Soviet Empire was unable to maintain its iron grip on that part of the world as economic problems started to grow and spiral in the Soviet Union as they kept on trying to spend money to keep up with the United States in terms of their military. They were unable to keep that going throughout this entire time because the United States had an overall stronger economy, especially under Reagan. As the economy is booming in the United States, the Soviet Union, not so much. Obviously, there's not as much incentive in a communist system to, make as much money for the country. You're going to get basically what you're assigned no matter what. That doesn't really change. Change for yourself, even if you are able to be a little bit more productive for the rest of the country, it doesn't make a huge difference for you. So there is no drive in a lot of these places to, compete for the most money like what we have in America. There's that constant sense of competition in the markets in America. You always want to be, on top of the new trends, investing in the right places. It wasn't happening in the USSR, and their economy struggled as a result. Um, Basically, it was proving the communist system was not working, especially on this grand scale. And so the Soviets have a new leader up in the top right, Mikhail Gorbachev, uh, rising to power and believing that major reforms are the only thing that are going to allow the USSR to survive. So he makes major reforms, and two big terms. One that we have here in our notes that you need to know is glasnost, which is the Russian term for basically speaking out openly, allowing criticism of the government, allowing people to speak their minds on how can things be improved. It's hoping in this way, to help find solutions through the minds and the opinions of the citizens living in the USSR. It's obviously a huge contrast to somebody like Stalin, who, if you spoke out against the government or Stalin or anything, you could find yourself, thrown into prison or worse. So all of that is all of that is now at play. Yeah, the end of the Cold War. Thank you, Kate, for that help there in the chat. Anyway, so all of these are they coming up. You also had Perestroika, which is a new revolutionary, basically trying to reinvigorate the Soviet economy there. But we have Glasnost there as part of our notes instead. And governments finally are starting to change with with this policy now. Many of these countries and these states under Soviet influence this entire time start to re-examine how they are run. They start to try and make some changes in the way the economy is working. Basically, there's a lot of people trying to go their own way now, pulling at the seams of this mighty empire. You start to see these cracks form, and you start to see the stability start to crumble in certain places, and their influence is not quite as iron grip as it used to be. So Gorbachev takes this initiative to try and reach out as well towards America, and tries to reach out towards some of their other enemies to make peace and to have this, policy of being open to the rest of the world for the first time and open to new ideas. Now, what this does is a few things. Number one, it really hurts his image in terms of the Communist Party, which he was a part of. They no longer have a whole lot of faith in this leader, because he's not following the same policies as his predecessors. Like, some people felt like he was betraying the communist ideals, the Marxist ideals that the USSR had been run under for a long time. And then on the other hand, some people felt like he was not necessarily being true to the complete and total overhaul of the economy. So what ends up happening is he resigns shortly after some of these changes, and leaves the seat of power as the USSR begins to now break up into pieces. As we were said, countries under this influence begin pushing back, making huge changes in the structure of the government. USSR is looking weak, and there are possible issues coming from all sides. And as I saw Dakota reference in the chat, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So let's take a look at that quick just quote from Ronald Reagan here.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So as you probably know, that's talking about the Berlin Wall in Germany. This is in 1987. Now, as you can see on here, that's going to be 2 years until the wall actually falls. It's Reagan basically making a plea out to Gorbachev to, take this action towards world peace, towards a better future, because Germany at this point was fully tired of Soviet rule, and they were ready to be reunited. And the rest of the world, rest of Europe was pretty much ready for that to happen as well. Faith had been restored as Germany had, been under, a tight thumb from the rest of the world throughout this time, and there were no longer, any aggressive actions for them to take, and they wanted them to be reunited so they can help, get the European economy up and running as best they can. It's a cultural hub now. It's really, a model country in many senses. Yeah, it's a cultural destination. It's a tourist spot, has a strong economy. All of that has been able to blossom and flourish in the years following this. So in '89, Gorbachev and the Soviets give in and they tear down the wall after German citizens are demanding that it falls and that Germany is reunited, and they end up officially reuniting in 1990 and becoming the Germany that we know today. Um, and as these countries begin to push back and basically uh, remove themselves from the Soviet Union, you have 15 new nations emerge from this once huge empire to a lot of smaller countries, and then of course still Russia. Now, these countries had difficult task of restructuring their government and their economy. Some of these spots, relied on each other very, very strongly under communism, and are going to have some trouble getting back and running. So the United States and other countries, other democratic countries, actually reach out to some of these nations and try and help them through trade and through loans to get back up on their feet and get running and get back and make sure that these new governments don't fail. So they are, continuing to spread democracy and capitalism instead of communism. Um, and some of these countries have been able to make a full, strong recovery. Others are still, struggling a little bit, but they have been able to stick around to today. So some of these countries were welcomed to NATO, as the U.S. again was eager to support new republics, support them, make sure that they are strong and working together towards a brighter future, hopefully, in many ways. So whew, let's continue on. There's not a whole lot left here, but we could see a timeline here of the Soviet Union starting to dissolve. So you could see these countries that broke away from the Soviets bit by bit. Now, why you may ask, why didn't this happen earlier? Part of it was because the USSR had a stronger economy and government earlier on, and were able to impose their will over some of these countries. Other reasons are, these countries may have wanted to stay in there as part of Soviet Union for the sake of economic and military protection. Working together was best, but was better early on. But as the world continued to modernize, and the United States was especially on top of a lot of technological revolutions and productivity increases, they weren't able to quite keep up, as innovation and things like that weren't as easy to come by in the USSR, because it wasn't as rewarding. You always ask that question: why would somebody go that extra mile to develop new technologies, to develop new innovations? And in the United States, the answer is easy. It's because you're going to get paid if you do so. You're going to make loads of money. In communist countries, it's not quite that simple. So that lack of competition, that lack of drive for innovation, certainly hurt the USSR in these times. So you can see Lithuania, backing out in 1990, March 11th, and Latvia, Georgia, Serbia, Slovenia, Kyrgyzstan, Estonia, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan in 1990 and 1991, all pulling out of the Soviet Union, becoming these independent nations, and all of those countries still exist to this day. Obviously, Russia has kind of. There's still a lot you could say about Russia and our current relationship with that country. Obviously, it is not necessarily a friendly, productive one. It's still quite contentious, and you can kind of see all of this long history as partly why that is. But just because that they're no longer the USSR, the communist hub of the world, doesn't mean that we are on great terms with them. So, in many ways, this Cold War, you could still feel those effects. We kind of go through a lot of Cold War stuff even to today. We are at, mini versions of Cold Wars with countries like North Korea and China, and still in many ways Russia. Um, Obviously, where we make those efforts to maintain peace, but I mean, just a few months ago, we were talking about the possibility of World War III, right? A lot of people thought that was a realistic thing, as we still have a pretty tough relationship with countries like Iran. Um, so Cold War is kind of still an idea that hangs over our heads to today. So aftermath. While the Cold War fortunately never developed into a direct war with the Soviet Union, it still affected American life for nearly 50 years. As, you know, Americans lived under constant threat that, the world could end through nuclear war at any given moment. Um, Hold on. Dakota, isn't one of the reasons Putin's president of Russia because Vladimir Putin defended KGB's offices East Germany from crowds of looters after the fall of the Berlin Wall? I believe that. I don't know as much about that situation, but I think that he was able to gain some amount of respect through politics for quite a while, and that would be one of it. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure on that specific story, but you know that's you're probably right. Anyway, so affecting life for 50 years, this constant threat of nuclear war. You've probably heard about the president of Russia. You're exactly right, William. Um, Again, we could go into modern stuff as a lot, but we're gonna wrap this up here. So this constant threat of nuclear warhead, you've probably heard and seen, examples of nuclear disaster drills in schools where kids would hide under their desks and hope that, if in the event of nuclear fallout, that would somehow protect them. Um, I mean, spoiler alert: hiding under a desk doesn't protect you from a nuclear bomb, unfortunately. But there was this constant threat hanging over everybody's head. Um, Throughout this time that many people were worried about. You watch some you watch some movies from 70s and 80s and before, and the very very common villain is going to be Russians, right? Or Soviets in that case. Even to today, we still portray those political enemies as villains and things like that in movies and TV shows. It's a very very common thing. And of course, the reverse is going to be true as well. And media from those countries, they're going to portray the United States as the horrible bad guys in many of these situations, as the enemies to be destroyed by forces of good. You could think of plenty of different movies where that's going to be the case, or the reverse is for the United States. Obviously, you probably don't know a whole lot of movies where the United States are the bad guys in foreign contexts, but um, yeah, it's a constant contentious relationship. So it had been a thing that had hung over Americans' heads for a long, long time. Obviously, we talked about Korea, Vietnam, hundreds of thousands who had fought. I believe we ended up losing over 100,000 soldiers in those wars combined. U.S. spends over $6 trillion on national defense during this. Obviously, huge amounts of money being poured into the military, and well, fortunately, it didn't go to full use. Obviously, there is use behind having a standing military. We've talked about that, but um, you know money that didn't end up being spent directly on war. Um, Cold War divides Americans over America's role in the world. We've talked about that. That's been some of our essential questions is how should the United States be involved in these areas? Why is it the United States' responsibility to get involved in places like Korea? Is it? I don't. It's that question that you really have to ask. Vietnam especially leads to a lot of debate and protest nationwide. It leads to a lot of anti-government movement from the United States people that really still persists to this day. There's still that that sense that the government has no idea what they're doing in many people's opinions, and now it's kind of switched into this political, party has no idea what they're doing, but it's kind of the still same idea has persisted. It's this constant questioning of, what is the government doing, and this huge scrutiny, like, and rightfully so. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's certainly just a trait that's led up to today. And finally, here with the Soviet threat lesson, Clinton ends up cutting a lot of military budgets, um, which is how he is able to achieve that surplus there. Of course, that didn't last, as we've talked about. These constant Cold Wars that we face today are still demanding a lot of money be poured into the military, and that's been the case from Bush to Obama to Trump. Is there's a lot of money being put into the military for the sake of defense, um, and why we are unable to get to that budget surplus today, at least in part. Obviously, it's a complicated thing. There's multiple things that go into that equation, but it's certainly a source of where we spend, or certainly a place where we spend a lot of money to this day. So, causes and effects. Few causes of the Cold War. Soviet Union takes control of Eastern European nations, a lot of the times through force, and communism begins gaining influence in developing nations. We talked about Cuba, Vietnam, Korea. And Western powers are afraid of that. We talked about the Iron Curtain speech from Winston Churchill, and this constant fear that communism is going to spread and take over the world. So, effects. What comes from it? Arms race between U.S. and the Soviet Union. Huge military spending by both countries and constant military development. Western powers and Soviet Union create military alliances. Warsaw Pact, NATO. Armed conflicts erupt in Korea and Vietnam. We talked about those. And the United States and Soviet Union compete for influence in developing nations, constantly going out there trying to spread influence in places like we talked about Afghanistan today, um, trying to be, to shape the world how they want. It becomes a global conflict for quite a long time before finally really coming to an end around 1991. All right, I think that's where we're gonna call it for now. So if you're watching on YouTube, that's the end of it for today. We are going to continue on to regional conflicts, which is the lesson 3, the last official lesson we're going to go through, and it's kind of just going to lead into what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the time. I'm probably going to put it all on this Unit 16 PowerPoint. Today at 1:30, we're gonna take a look at some old Jeopardy questions because I always like doing that, for some fun. But hey, if you want to stick around, you can.